My position on the shroud, well, as much as I appreciate it and spiritually have some affinity for it, especially in looking at it very closely, I would say my faith will continue whether the shroud is or is not. If I was there, I would respect it. And, I have no problem with it. I would like for it to be, if I could, I suppose, this is it. This is the real thing, and this is why. And there's to be no contradiction of that. But we can't even do that in science. I admire the physical scientists far more than by my biomedical colleagues, only because I think the physical scientists are those who really have something to talk about. But on the other hand, life isn't that way. It isn't always cut and dried. Now, let me see. I was going to just say this. One thrust or approach that I'm taking today is a little bit unusual in terms of my focus. And that's because there is something I think is pretty exciting out there in terms of understanding the shroud. And that's due to a group of scientists in Italy at the International Institute of Advanced Studies of Space, but not NASA Space Representation Sciences and Projective Geometry. Oh, what a wonderful place to be. If I was 2 years younger, there might be a career change scheduled for me, because I've always appreciated that quantitative analysis of space and perception. It began with my appreciation of it from more of a philosophical point of view when I was in college. But nonetheless, they have, and that will be online too. You'll find it, but I can give you specific directions later. And they have employed a technique called projective geometric restitution. And they restitute the image. It's a way of probing or interrogating that famous image of the shroud to give us much more evidence of its veracity. So with that, having said that, let us proceed. So let's look at it. I'm going to begin with the kind of statistics of the shroud. It's made out of a linen fabric. It has a herringbone weave and a nice pattern. The length is 14 feet by 3 feet, and the width is 3 feet by 7 inches. The areas of discoloration that you see on the shroud, probably the most visual thing that jumps out at you is due to the discoloration that came both with water damage in regions of the shroud, as well as burned areas that were later repaired in time. Blood stains also appear as pale reddish carmine red stains abundantly within the area of the body image of the shroud, and it's thought to be the Sidon or the cindarium or burial cloth of Christ. It has a number of different names. The image, however, reveals a nude male, well proportioned, approximately 80 kilograms in weight. That would be convert to 176 pounds, approximately 5 feet 9, 5 feet 7 to 5 feet 9 inches in height, approximately 30 to 40 years of age. So it falls in a nice area of correlation with Jesus's age and appearance. The area of the head, I'll go through this a little bit later, but right now just kind of a grocery list. Has a forked beard, as we'll see a little bit better later on, a well-defined mustache, shoulder-length hair parted in the middle, something of a hippie appearance from the 1970s, I guess. The face is long, projected along a narrow visage with the prominent eyebrows, and that's largely due to a kind of a well-developed area we call the supraorbital tori above the eye sockets themselves. The nose is long and narrow, small wounds that are found around the forehead and the back of the head. The chest is well developed in terms of chest muscles and its appearance. The chest appears to be in an inhalation point of capture. So there was a deep breath taken in at the moment that image was in fact formed. The chest, as it says here, is in a fixed inspiratory phase, and the body was laid on a folded cloth with hands folded over the area of the groin. In terms of the arms and hands, the hands appear without thumbs. It's not very clear here, but it will become a little bit clearer later on. The left hand is slightly grasps the area and conceals the dorsum of the right hand and part of its wrist, and the left wrist bears a large round wound. There are dark stains that are found on the cloth showing the various wounds throughout. This is not the best image for it, but I'll show you one a little bit later on. That's better. The legs and the feet from the front, the legs extend down to the level of the ankles, while the back of the right leg, the entire sole. Now, this image unfortunately got reversed. I don't know what, but that is in fact the right leg and showing the entire sole of the right foot. From the front, the left leg is less visibly distal near the ankle and foot and is equally attenuated by the right. From the back, a large blood stain drains the puncture wound in the middle of the right foot. On the back, there is evidence of lacerations, especially in the upper region of the chest from behind. There's a great deal of bruising on either shoulders and various stains which are presumed to be blood. And the calves show evidence here of trauma as well. Now, on December 4th in 1532, the shroud sustained damage from a fire that burned several holes in the fabric and later on were repaired by the Poor Clare nuns. And a backing was placed on the shroud to help preserve its extent. And still has been replaced several times throughout the history of the shroud and provides additional support for the shroud when it's moved around. Unfortunately, the documentation is pretty sketchy. Prior to the mid-1400s, the shroud first emerged historically in 1354, when it was recorded in the hands of the famed knight Geoffrey du Charnay, who was the lord of the local town in which he lived in Liray, France. In 1453, his granddaughter gave the shroud to the House of Savoy, and there it was damaged further by the fire I mentioned earlier in 1532, and then was moved to the capital of Turin, where it remains to this day in 1578. Now, I'm going to go back to that earlier history later on, but only after you've absorbed some other facts. Let us begin at the turn of the last century, late in the last century, in the 19th century, which really began the first scientific thinking about the shroud. Up to that point, people didn't seem to care whether it existed or not. But because it became a little bit more prominent, it kind of caught the interest of those people who would like to know more information about it. Before that point, that was not in fact the case. And that came with this fellow here, Secundo Pia, who was an amateur photographer. In 1898. He was allowed for the first time to photograph the shroud. So he took the first photograph of the shroud on May 25th of that year. Now, around midnight, of course, that was the old type of camera that was, in fact, developed. The image was developed on plates. So he had to go back later in the evening to develop those plates. And what he found, he almost, as he said here, almost dropped and broke the photographic plate in the darkroom, because what emerged was an incredible image that he really couldn't see in the light image of the shroud, but only with a copy of the negative, which in fact then became a positive image. In 1931, another photographer, Giuseppe Emery, a portrait photographer, rephotographed the Shroud of Turin and provided further documentation, which was much better quality than Pia's original one. And so as a result, we have still those sodium bromide plates, silver bromide plates that can still be used for image analysis because he gave it the more natural color that comes with the photographic exposure of the image on silver bromide. The resolution, as I said, is so high that even today it can still be used for research purposes and has been. There is a better way of approaching those better images by using image analysis, and image analysis that can in fact include, should I say, cleaning up the image, not altering the image, but cleaning up the image so it becomes clear, simply enhancing that which is already present so it becomes more visible and easier to see by the naked eye. So a lot of sophistication has been made. For example, the so-called salt and pepper region of the general appearance of the image can be reduced. That's called signal to noise ratio. So that has been greatly improved to enhance our visibility of the image. Now, returning to Pia's original photographic work, although not as sophisticated as subsequent documentation, it did, however, begin, as I said before, this trend in the scientific interest in the shroud. We had, for the first time, some real physical documentation of what this shroud looked like. And this inspired a member of the French Academy, or a candidate for membership. He was really the student of another professor who sponsored him to look at this with a scientific interest. And his name was, in fact, Paul Vignon. He was actually a zoologist, but he had a great deal, level of sophistication for, how should I say, a greater understanding of things. For example, he was an artist and several other professions as well as a zoologist. He was an assistant to this Professor Delange, who was an agnostic and atheist at the French Academy. But at any rate, when he did the analysis of the shroud, his impressions on the, he concluded that the impressions on the Holy Shroud are in fact produced by a kind of chemical action, largely without an absolute contact between the body and the cloth. So that was a bit of scientific information that was not really appreciated up until that point. And then this Professor Delange presented his information to the French Academy. And of course, that was met with a lot of resistance and disbelief, but he determined that the body had been wrapped in the shroud was in fact the body of Jesus without being a Christian or a believer. He also, Vignon concluded that the shroud is not a painting, a negative image that's well beyond any capability of an artist from the Renaissance era. No pigments were involved in its imaging. The imaging is an impression of a human corpse produced by the action of what somebody referred to as natural forces. And then he would take those natural forces and later on reformulate them into a theory called the vaporograph theory. And this was in fact based on the fact that the image was produced by the hot, this is a nice way of saying hot and sweaty, a febrile sweat that bathed the dead body and contained urea that changed to ammonium, released, which in effect released ammoniac vapor. And with the mixture of spices and aloes on the body, the reaction is to produce a staining vapor or emanations that mix with the humid air trapped between the body surface and the shroud, and this left the imprint on the shroud itself. So the stain is impressed upon a receptive surface, adhering to the topographic features of the body. The reaction was very negative, as I said before. They thought he was overstepping. The scientists in the French Academy thought he was overstepping his ability in this regard, and they made some fun of him. So far, this was a quote from a review, so far there is just enough vraisemblance in the hypothesis, they use the word étude scientifique, which was a way of kind of deriding it as this hypothesis to lead the unwary to think that Dr. Vignon has established his case, which they did not think he had with this so-called vaporograph theory. We would return to him later on because he has an additional theory. He went quiet for about 30 years and then published a second book, which was quite an impressive book. And in there, he will present a thesis or a hypothesis that we will look at later that approaches the veracity of the shroud from a totally different point of view, from an evolutionary artistic point of view. But for right now, let's proceed then to the next phase of scientific investigation. And this was by a doctor who later published a book called The Doctor at Calvary. And he applied the methodology of forensic pathology. So he did a pathological analysis of the image and analyzed the methods of infliction and physiological effects of each wound on the body. And so established more or less the shroud in the context of the mechanics of crucifixion. And that was going to be a part of this talk, that is to say, because that would be more my interest, actually is the physiological impact of crucifixion and the ultimate cause of death. But I have to keep myself here under control and pass on. Now, in 1973, there's Max Frey, and later on, we'll see what portion of the shroud he utilized, but he was given permission to take a small sample to do so-called dust samples of the shroud and look for pollen, which he did, and he identified 22 pollen species indigenous to the regions, and they just so happen to be very crucial regions for the history of the shroud. That is to say, Constantinople, a city called Edessa, and also those that are found in Jerusalem, the area of Jerusalem itself. So he was a forensic pathologist as well, with special ability in pollen analysis. Now, another major step was in 1975 and 76 when two Air Force scientists, John Jackson and Erich Jumper, decided that they were going to analyze something they had developed in terms of image analysis, a machine and analyzer called the BP8 image analyzer. To use that it was able to retrieve encoded three-dimensional data that cannot be seen in reflected light, and subject the shroud to that sort of analysis. And of course, what they found was that the image on the shroud is shown to be consistent with the body shape covered with a naturally draping cloth. Visible image in the shroud did not appear to be a work of an artist. Does it also appear to be the result of direct contact only, diffusion, radiation from a body shape or engraving, dabbling powder or bas-relief or electrostatic imaging? So they eliminated all that. But what they found was, in fact, that this image analyzer, even though it converts image density into vertical relief, it is useless on two-dimensional objects in terms of light photography, because what you get is a distortion. But on the shroud, what happens is that when it's applied, it results in an accurate topographic image showing the correct relief characteristics of a human form. And these are sometimes referred to as tridimensional restoration. Now, if you have your 3D glasses on, you can appreciate this more because, because on this side is a 3D image of the head of the shroud. And of course, you remember, perhaps, I don't think you're that old that you used them. Maybe I have, but that was just for fun. You have those stereoscopic glasses. And what a stereoscopic glass does is each side tilts slightly and is within the realm of what we call the extracanthy diameter. And that precision quality image capture is something that produces tricks the brain really into seeing a three-dimensional object. So if you have your glasses on, yeah, hurry. Right, but you can share very quickly, exchanging back and forth. Because I can't really move on until you have them on. But here's what maybe a three-dimensional would look like. It looks like a rather confused, without the tricking the brain, looks like a somewhat confused image. Yes, you're going to look, no, you have to take them out of the package. It's tricky because you can look through them a little bit, but the full effect comes only if you take them out and wear them like real glasses. You're all going to look very curious, but I'm seeing you, you don't see yourself. But at any rate, you no doubt had this experience when you were younger and you went to a newly emerging technology called 3D vision. Yeah, just raise your hand if you need one. Now, for those who are looking at it, can you see a 3D image in this face at all? A little bit. It's there, and it is a 3D image. On the left side. It's on this side here. Now, what we're going to do, to appreciate that more, I'm going to give you a 3D image. I can get this to, there you go. Now you can see that, no doubt. Can you see the 3D? Now you can go back to this and you appreciate this more, okay? So that's one way of visualizing a two-dimensional, but it's a matter of tricking the cortical routing of the brain, nerves going to the cortical region of the brain. Now, if we take the image of and use it in terms of image analysis, now this is not a 3D image, so you don't need your glasses for that. You can take them off now. Very short experience. But what you have here is the type of image analysis that can be generated now that shows much greater detail than this sort of fake picture here. And as you can see, as it moves, it generates that information. For example, I can see dimensions that, well, I don't know what happened there. I don't know what exactly happened. See if I can find it again. Well, it disappeared. Anyway, this is the same type of image. So with this type of image analysis, oh, there it is. It's even weird. You can see detail. And in this case, then we can apply mathematically certain geometrical analyses or methods in order to interrogate that image. And I'm going to show you that in just a few minutes. Just some additional notes ultimately determined that the image on the shroud was darkest at the points where the body and the cloth came into direct contact with each other, but there's no transference of any kind of physical particulate matter to the shroud from that intimate association with the shroud itself. So you'll get an intensity or a density, topographical density map simply by the position or the distance of the shroud to the surface of the body, which becomes more in relief and darker as it gets closer to the surface of the body. Now, the peculiar thing about the shroud is that there is a projection of image that isn't touching the body at all. And yet, in some instantaneous moment, something happened to transfer the image that was not close to the shroud itself, which is even more of interest, I think, in terms of understanding. Now, very quickly, when you use light photography, you're simply looking at a contour in a flat plane. You have nothing in terms of the additional information of distance. In the shroud, that information is provided because of the relationship of the density increase in terms of the patterns that come with that change in density. Looking at this again, yeah, so you can get that tridimensional impact of the image that is produced only in terms of the difference in the density, which is based on the spatial relationship of the fabric of the shroud to the surface of the body in time. Now, in 1978, there would come the first organized scientific team to study the Shroud of Turin. It was known as the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or the STURP. And in 1978, there was a celebration for the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the Shroud in Turin. And so this group thought, aha, this is our chance to really zoom in and to be able to do some real scientific work on the Shroud. Now, as you can see, the list of people here is quite impressive. Not only the number, but where they came from, all Los Alamos Laboratories, Brooks Institute, the Oceanographic Association, the Western Connecticut State University, which at that time was well known for its research. And so as a result, this was a pretty Air Force Academy, as I said, Los Alamos, United States Air Force, and the New England Institute. And these people were pretty well known in their respective areas. Now, this fellow here, Barry Schwartz, he was quite a character. I'll show you a picture of him in just a few minutes. He was the only Jew at that time. He was the only Jewish fellow in the group. And they would tease him like, what's a good Jewish boy like you doing in this group, you know, wanting to know more about Jesus, huh? You're in the wrong place, boy, which I always think is rather amusing. Now, we can now conclude that the shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. It is not a product of the artist. As this group will be the first to now analyze the hemoglobin and serum albumin content of the blood. But they will also introduce some problems that remained unsolved. Now, what did they do? They made a list of all the things, types and approaches and methodologies that they would use once they were in Turin. So this whole group packed up all their equipment and everything and flew to Turin. I'm not sure how they pulled that off. There were only a few that could not actually go, but most of them went. And they did this kind of analysis, which is pretty impressive, although it's still, if you wish, a non-invasive, or destructive analysis. And that's because Rome would never let anyone analyze. They let only that one fellow earlier to do some analysis, but no great convergence of experts to analyze. So because they did not want it destroyed. So they had to choose all those techniques. They were powerful techniques and they provided a lot of information, but they were also still limited because they could not do everything that they needed to do. So, as I said before, they converged on Turin during this particular 400th anniversary. And there's Barry, the young Jewish fellow at the time who was within that group. And there's the original camera. So that gives you some idea. When Pier Secundo took the picture, there's his camera. That was not a pocket camera by any means. And I think that's why Barry is getting such a charge out of it compared to the camera around his neck. At any rate, the shroud was brought in. Their equipment arrived from the States after some troubles with customs. And then the force of the Poor Clare sisters unwrapped and eventually did some alteration so that this Professor Rigi could, in fact, use a endoscopic camera to look at the back of the shroud. Because the backing had been put on subsequently after the earlier damages in order to protect it. These pictures also give you some perspective of how big the shroud is. The 14 feet is quite a sizable extent of material that has to be analyzed. So I included these pictures in order to give you some idea. And here's Rigi again, when inserting his camera. He wanted to look at the back, especially in the areas of blood stains. So he did some analysis of that. The halo was determined to be serum in nature, oozing from the blood stain. They also did some inference photography from behind to see if the image is reflected when light is projected from behind, and a lot of other types of approaches that could be taken. They did photographic maps of whenever they sampled an area using those techniques, they knew exactly where it was on the shroud itself. And then, of course, they were able, with that kind of sophisticated photography, to do a real thorough study of the stains, for example, in relation to the actual thread and pattern. Now came the summary of conclusions. No pigments, paints, dyes, or stains were found in the woven fibrils. X-ray fluorescence and microchemistry of the fibrils eliminated the possibility of paint in order to produce the image. This was confirmed by ultraviolet and infrared photography as well. So they use these techniques to derive some general and yet specific aspects, largely through photographic methods. There were no known chemical or physical methods that can really account for the totality of the image, was one of the basic take-home messages. Otherwise, the blood work turned out to be determined to be AB and male. The DNA test was limited to samples that could be taken by a vacuum, kind of a small vacuum cleaner, and deposited on filter paper. So they concluded it's an ongoing mystery until further studies could be conducted. The problem, and therefore, remains unsolved as to whether or not it is true. But at any rate, they published a number of papers from their studies, so it was well interrogated during the short time that they were there. I think they were only there for a few days when that had the right window open. And later on in 1984, that same group, they maintained their allegiance during the intervals following their analysis as a specific group, but they came together again as a group in 1984 and suggested that 26 tests that they didn't perform in the previous study could be administered to yield more definitive information. And they submitted that to Rome, and Rome said, no more 26 tests, only one more test. And that is the test of carbon-14 by atomic mass spectrophotometry. And so as a result, this came the famous test that supposedly was going to give the real date of the shroud. Now, the small samples that were collected for the carbon-14 were taken from a very discrete area of the Shroud of Turin. And there were only so many places that were designated for its testing. The University of Arizona had a small area in the patch, the University of Zurich, another area, and Oxford University with cooperation through the British Museum had their area of sampling. And then there was a second patch that was also used by the University of Arizona. This was retained by the Vatican, and this was the earlier patch that was done by Ray in his not toxicological, but pollen analysis. So those are the areas from this little area of the shroud. Now, that might seem fair enough, but as we'll see in just a few minutes, that itself yields some difficulty. So radiocarbon, just a few words about this type of testing. No doubt you've heard this before because everything is old and needs to be determined in terms of how old it actually is, will be subjected, if it's significant enough, to this type of testing. And it's not a small procedure. As you can see, this is the type of equipment, the single type of equipment needed for this type of mass spectrophotometry. So the radiocarbon dating relies on the fact that living plants and animals contain 3 types of carbon during their lifetime: carbon-12, carbon-13, and carbon-14. Now, of those 3 sources of carbon that forms in any organic organism, it will be carbon-12 and 13 that will remain constant, will never change. During the life of an animal, or even us as human beings, we absorb from the atmosphere radiation, and it's in the form of carbon-14 from the atmosphere. Now, the interesting thing about carbon-14 is that from the moment of death, if there's no external contamination, and that's very, very important, because that will throw everything off. You can feed the information to the most sophisticated piece of spectrophotometry and you'll get an inaccurate result if there's any suspicion that there is contamination in the sample. Now, at the time of death, if there is no contamination, the organism becomes a closed system wherein isotopes 12 and 13 remain constant, no change. Even though death has occurred, the concentration of those carbon forms remain forever stable. However, carbon-14 begins to degenerate at a known pattern. So as that degenerates in age, that can, and remember, it stops at the time of death in time. So as that decreases, and forms what we call half-life. That means the concentration change over is known at a known rate of about, in this case, 5,700 years. So in 5,700 years, exactly 1/2 of that concentration of carbon can be determined. So it's something that can be very definite in terms of producing what is called a radiocarbon age of a given sample. So what were the results then of this famous test? We reported in Nature magazine, and that's the starship or the flagship of all scientific journals in Europe, Science being the American counterpart. And their results were reported, and they supposedly had 95% confidence level. And their date for the shroud was somewhere between the interval of 1260 and 1390. So that would indicate the shroud is from the medieval period or from the Middle Ages, and not as old as it would have to be if it was the shroud that was found around the body of Christ. Now, the result of these measurements of 3 laboratories on 4 textile samples with a total of 12 data sets, and they simply cut those samples up. They have to be destroyed. They will be destroyed, carbonized. Were simply from the same area of each sample, so it was kind of a duplicate. And then they also used a control from a fabric of a known age. So the results of the 3 control samples agree well with previous radiocarbon dates and or for historical, so-called historical sites. Now, there was, after this, a variety of objections that were raised almost immediately in response to these conclusions. And most of them were based on, again, the site of the sampling, because it was felt by most people that this area had been contaminated from handling of the shroud. Now, remember, I told you if there's any source of potential contamination, and that contamination could come, if this is fabric, if I simply place my hand firmly enough on the fabric, then that piece of fabric would be contaminated. Any radiocarbon dating of that segment of the fabric would be probably incorrect. So some sources say that because of the handling, the threads on the region of testing proved by some to have been contaminated with dye and adhesive resin when they put that backing on the shroud, because that backing was formed around the edges to connect with the actual shroud. The dye stuff was found within fibers within that so-called ray region that he had analyzed earlier. He had found himself some contamination there when he was doing the pollen analysis. And then they subjected subsequently different types of analyses. And what they found is from that region, it was not, how should I say, reflective of the general using these forms of so-called multispectral false color generators, including the so-called blue quad mosaic image that is produced, clearly showed that that area is different from the rest of the cloth. So it was not a good form of testing. They even determined that there was a source of gradation as you moved across the cloth in terms of the information that it could yield, and that there was a strong coefficient of correlation when they did that analysis in terms of the distancing from the actual sampling area. So immediately people took exception to that. But because it was carbon-14, because it had been done by Zurich and Arizona, which is well known for its carbon-14 dating ability, and also for Oxford, you know, who's going to argue with those people? You know, those are experts naturally, so they know everything. So because of that, people didn't believe. They said, oh, look at the right wing, or the, what do they call that when you get into those groups that are weird or whatever, ultra-right, whatever it is. They were classified as troublemakers who were taking exception to real science. Now, a real scientist would be skeptical of the so-called result for a number of reasons as well. But they didn't step up because, you know, they're always looking to their side to see who is, you know, behind them or with them. And they dare not step out of that group. So that's helped create the division that came with the credibility of the shroud. But additional studies were in fact carried out, including one called wide-angle X-ray scattering. And this is based on the aging of the cellulose that is found in the flax of the weave of the Shroud of Turin. And when you use this kind of, it's illuminated by X-rays, and they can be deflected and scattered and produce very complex patterns. And those patterns can indicate the age of the particular sample. Now in 2022, they applied the so-called wax technique, and they took other things of known historical, for example, I think this one was from the mummies in Egypt. That sample was known historically to be that old. So, and then they took something younger as well. Then they put all those together and analyzed them using the wax technique. And what did they find? They found that in between the two parameters, the 1400 years as being the earlier and 5,000 being the oldest, that the Shroud of Turin fabric did in fact indicate an age that was well within 2,000 years. So this was reported subsequently. Now, if you look at the data, what we have here is almost an outlier, because this is the younger date of the Shroud of Turin that was produced by carbon-14 here. Now, look at the older date of the shroud that is produced when it's analyzed by the wax technique, another one called vanillin, another one called Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, and Raymond, as well as mechanical analysis of the actual pre-instability of the fibers themselves. So you have a set of data of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all indicate an older date and still that young outlying date of carbon-14. So that's enough also to arouse your suspicion of the dating based exclusively on carbon-14. Now, as I said before, these are simply data points that I mentioned earlier. The figure is muscular, well built. I think all of these I mentioned earlier. This simply compares now with the better imaging that we have to base that on. Abrasions on the scalp and throughout the body. There are more than 100 scourge marks on the shroud, puncture wounds. More and more analysis has been done using more and more sophisticated approaches to the Shroud of Turin. Now, I'm in something of a hurry to try to get to this technique that I talked about earlier, which is projective geometrical restitution. When you look at an object that is three-dimensional, your vision is contaminated, certainly by angularity, but what we call in general perspective. So there's two ways to analyze something in space, whether it's that table or bodies that are in front of me, because some bodies, even though she may be the exact height and weight of this fellow here, she will appear larger and bigger only because of her proximity to me, and he's farther away. So no matter where you look, there's contamination of perspective. So in order to understand a three-dimensional object that will naturally generate an impulse to analyze it from this, what we call perspective projection, we use another type of geometrical approach that is called, referred to as parallel projection. And that's a technological or a geometrical method, which is based mathematically, really, on lines, converging lines. In this case of looking from perspective, there's going to be a vanishing point. If I got so far back there, my colleague, O, a young novice there, he's really small and I'm huge, you see? And if we kept going and pushing him farther and farther back, he would become smaller and smaller and smaller till there's a vanishing point. Well, we don't want that. That's contamination. So what we want to look at is we want to be able to take that, pull that in a parallel, using parallel lines from the vertices to reproduce that image or probe that image using this restitution technique. Now, when you look at an object, that comes through the lens that will refocus it on the retina in the back, the retinal epithelium at the, not only the back, but largely in the back, but it comes around towards the top as well. And that will, in fact, clarify the image and give it the perspection that you know can be converted into both three-dimensional and two-dimensional as well. This lens is very important, and if you remember in Mark chapter 8, verses 22 through 26, is the miracle of the man. They bring the blind man, he can't see, so they bring him to Jesus and they said, heal him. And so the blind man's not going to have any disagreement with that possibility. He doesn't say much, and then Jesus first of all, he wets his finger, his thumb, and he places it on the man. That's what Mark says. He places it. And then he asked the man, can you see? And what does the man say? Oh, I see people. They look like trees. Well, number one, that indicates it's not congenital blindness, but a blindness that occurred later in life, because he knows what trees should look like, or people should look like. He said, I think they look like people, but I think they also look like trees. And so you know right away that something has happened to the lens, and he's probably got bad cataracts. Well, because Jesus has taken probably his thumb and pressed the lens down, what will happen is that the lens will release and be pushed down into the back of the eye here. And what will happen? Will he go blind? No, he's not going to be blind. He's going to be able to see. But all the information comes in. It's no longer information that is clearly focused. It's out of focus information. So he asked the man, can you see? Well, it looks like trees. So what happens is everything becomes distorted or enlarged because you have no lens to focus that information. Then Jesus puts his hands on him again and heals him a second time, in a sense, and the man says that he can see. So that's a very interesting episode in chapter 8 of Mark, and it has to do with the physiology of vision here and the role of the crystalline lens in forming an image. So what we want to do is that we want to take something that's somewhat equivalent to an X-ray machine, because that type of analysis will go deep into the tissue like an X-ray and be able to convert into a two-dimensional object here something that is really quite three-dimensional, because you can, because of the shadowing, you can see the patterns and the outlines, the densities of bone or tissue. So what is the projection pattern that is produced in the image? Here we have that, again, that image that we saw before. So if we use, instead of light source, a radiation source, which is also a form of radiation as well, but even a stronger particle radiation, we can enhance that image in terms of its depth from a two-dimensional point of view, converted image that really reflects a three-dimensional object. So this is called geometric restitution of perspective, or the inverse method of perspective. It is a technique for reconstructing the base elements of perspective. So we're going to take them, and if we look at this geometrically, you can in fact take an object that is three-dimensional, you can convert it into a two-dimensional object that can be analyzed then, such as a photographic plate or a photograph that really reflects mathematically those angles that can produce this type of shape from a two-dimensional point of view. Now, I go into some detail here, and I'm not so sure. We're going to go through it quickly now because I think that there's some overkill here. Looking at the various vertices of perspection, we can simply take and look at how clear. We can look at this, but if it's only the front of this, we see only the front. But if we know that relationship, and we can analyze it from other similar relationships, we can generate and rotate those axes to produce the kind of image that will give us all the information of the subject being viewed or sample being viewed, but in a two-dimensional way. So if we look at this, for example, if we alter the angle of the vertices of these known angles, you can see how it changes the whole perspective only based on the analysis of this areas here. You can reconstruct then the entire 3D dimension. Now, let me try this
Marking
again. Now,
orange pen the clearly discernible outlines of some objects that we will shortly identify and restitute. These images are extremely important because they show the remarkably clear, flawless contours on which the identification and restitution of the body and objects are based. We will later see that these lines belong to the outline of the same object, and that radiation produced the object's image while it adopted different positions, or in other words, while it was moving. And the phenomenon is not limited to this object. There are actually dozens of often partially superimposed images of the same.
That's okay, it's just over with. It was just so if we use this technique, for example, now you have to have very good eyes to see this, and the light might be too bright to see them. But I think if I draw them out in a parallel way here, and here, and here, not so easy to see, but here. So there are lines in there that you can see that you normally don't see that will give you dimensionality of the image. And this indicates, interestingly enough, that this is a change in this line through time. So this object has actually moved during a very short time, almost a flash second of image capture. And that tells us, that's going to tell us a lot about the analysis. This is what we also call the strobal capture, strobotopic capture. If you've seen in photography how they can stop the action of a moving object. This is like those lines that we saw before in the cloth itself that indicates what? A movement from this position to this position, or from this position to this position. So we can actually see that reflected in the cloth itself. Now, I think that was supposed to move if I wait, maybe. There we go. There we go. All right. So if we look, and using that technique, then we can reconstruct, in a sense, deeper structures that normally are not seen on a two-dimensional frame or a plane. Okay, so this image contains exact frontal view, and it shows why. It shows a long nose, a mustache, beard, and half parted here. The beard's half parted, coming down on both sides of the. I keep skipping. Coming down on both sides, one a little longer than the other side. So you might say not a well-kept hair or beard. There's a large swelling below the right eye. There's our swellings, well, at any rate. So these swollen areas reflect most likely blows or a blunt object. The face also in the maxillary region here, especially the left side, shows displacement of the mandible. I don't know. Well, at any rate, we have to go on. Now, if we look at this, just this region of the head here, provided it's going to stay. If we look at that, we can see images that reflect the flow of blood, and the head alone is able to determine, or it can be determined, that these vessels indicate both veins and arteries that are bleeding. I don't know what the problem is, but it's just not working right. Well, I've kind of spoiled it, but if we look at that area of the head, we know, of course, that we can expect a crown of thorns. But it's not only the crown of thorns himself. If we look at the head and reconstruct that images based on the restitution, we will find that it shows something very intriguing. On the front, it seems to show almost like a wreath of flowers and something round, leaves and whatever. And if we go on, and look at even more closely, This is not working well. What we find at the back of the head, now we're looking at the back of the head, we will find the thorns coming out. So most of the thorns that were on the head seems to have been placed in this kind of wreath, and most of the thorns are in the back. So you ask yourself the question, several questions, why are the thorns only in the back? Well, I mean, in the back of the head, but the flowers go all the way around. It could have been the way they wove the crown, but the flowers are the interesting part. You didn't expect to see flowers on Jesus's crowned head. That's because when was Jesus crucified? He was crucified in the early spring. If you look at the plant that is reflected in that image, it's Sarcopenia Proterium spinosum, which is the genus and species of the most likely type of plant that was used to weave the crown of thorns. It was early in the spring. When you look at this, in the early spring, the thorns are incredibly enmeshed with berries and the actual flowers of the plant. So in order to weave that, you have to find some areas that have more thorns and less flowers, but it's often difficult to see. You look at this from a distance, you say, oh, what a lovely bush you have in your garden. Let me pick one of those flowers, and you will find out how quickly that plant is enmeshed with thorns. In the springtime, the thorns would be largely hidden, which offers some explanation, perhaps, of why you have this restituted image that indicates much more on the head than just the crown of thorns. We always think of the thorns as being only solitary images in that wreath around the head. But as it turns out, using this technique, and there are the berries that are also present among the thorns and the flowers as well. So if you consider, if you want to quickly make a crown of thorns, you'd have to go in, pick what you could find, wrap it around, and then attach it to the head, which is exactly what you find on the restituted form of the head region of the Shroud of Turin. Now let's look at another area that is equally fascinating. And this area is going to be along the right arm. And what do we find here if we restitute? The restitution of chain segments along near the wrist of the right arm is another demonstration of the projection arrays that were parallel with the image and the exposure to radiation, which formed the image. And here you can see them enlarged in that area that runs right along here. So chains that are linked along that arm. Now, let's look at another area of the body in which there is a latent image that can be restituted using this technique, which seems to show some kind of clothing attached to the body. And sure enough, if you look at in great detail, what you find is a type of garment that is in fact found and would fit perfectly over the body image of the Shroud of Turin that is found in this period of Jewish clothing. One is called the chalcedon. The chalcedon is a part of the underwear. It's shorter in front, longer in back. It's rather tight fitting. And the other aspect of it is it usually has a belt. In those days, it was not uncommon in that era to have a snakeskin belt around your caleçon. Caleçon is the French caleçon de bain. Caleçon de bain means swim trunks in French. Can't go to the Riviera without your caleçon de bain. They'll arrest you. Not the French, they probably let you swim at leisure. So if we look at this again, we add another picture to the shroud. And that is, we have the image already of the blood coagulating or collecting rather around the waist, especially in the posterior of the body, along here and again along here. Now, along with that restituted form, we find the calisson, and it also reveals a faint impression around the waist area of the Shroud of Turin. And if you look at that very, very carefully, you can only see just bits and pieces of it. Do you see anything? Not that. That's an artifact of the burn area. Do you see anything running through here? Well, if you looked at it very closely, there's a better picture of it here. What you can find is a belt-like structure that has almost like a buckle, and it has a pattern that seems to be woven in or part of the texture of the belt. If you look at that belt further, that was not uncommon to find in that era, that these were, in fact, imported snake skins from Africa and match almost perfectly the genus of Ragus python that is found in Africa. Now, if we look at the head again, we're going to find something very surprising as well. There are small rings that fall from the area of the crown down across the eye socket along the nasal septum. Now, why would Jesus be wearing a chain? And it's not a chain like what we're going to see on the arms, which are holding the arms together. It's not a form of containment. It seems to be more decoration. Well, what was Jesus wearing a decorative piece of jewelry on the crucified cross? That doesn't make sense, but the story continues. Now, if we look at this chain, it has 21 links running along its length, as I said, from the top of the head down across the forehead, the brow ridge, across the socket, and along the nasal septum. Now, if I can get this to work, this is what I was afraid of. Remember when you converted put the two together, this is what happens. I tried putting them all three together, but what happens is you lose the contrast, the yellow against the blue. At any rate, so if you look at this, we can see clearly that it's a rather beautifully formed linkage of chain. Now, we need to jump some to geography here, and we're going to take a quick trip to Spain, because in Spain, there is also another cloth that has no image of Jesus' face on it. It's more of a cloth, it's not a whole shroud, but it's definitely a cross, and it contains a pattern of blood displacement across it. And this is known as also as a sudarium or the mandolin as well. Some of these names are interchangeable, which creates some confusion. Oviedo, Spain. It measures 85 by 52 centimeters. There is no face on that, but only patterns of blood stains of differing intensity. Now, if they analyze this, they can find, for example, areas of similarity, not only between the blood stains, but even the physicality of the texture of the Shroud of Turin. And what does that reveal? Well, it reveals something very interesting. It reveals a type of compact fabric, folded fabric. It has been folded a number of 80 some times, both longitudinally as well as transversely, to create this kind of pillow. And on one side of the pillow is a collection of blood that has been absorbed, okay? Of course, if you unfold it, you get the other image, But when you take, let's go back for a second. When I take this and I fold this along the vertical axis as well as the horizontal axis, ending up with some 80-some folds, what do I generate? I generate a small pillow-like structure that's 114 millimeters by 57 millimeters, about the size of a handkerchief, very, very thick handkerchief, maybe about an inch in thickness. Well, what does that have to do? And it's permeated with blood. What does that have to do? And these are some other aspects of it. For example, over in this little clot of blood or stain of blood here is the form of M that forms. There are also these darker collections along this wider expanse of blood stain as well. Now, if you superimpose another structure that's found in the restituted Shroud of Turin, there is an M shape as well that occurs in that. Now, if we take that chain, we can attach it to a structure that has the same kind of M shape, a little bit of the blood. And what do we find? And what do we find? We can superimpose that same small pillow on the forehead of the image in the Shroud of Turin, to which is attached this long chain. Now, if we look at this in the end, what do we find? That undoubtedly, given its kind of collective appearance, that small piece of cloth that had been folded up in this particular pillow-like shape, part of it stained deeply with blood coming from the head, another part that has no blood. This apparently, if we look at this area here, there's the clip. And that's also reflective. What is that clip? It's a type of what we call fibula, that can be found. Those were types that were used during the period, like a clip to hold fabric in place. So if I wanted to hold this, connect this together, I would use what we call a fibula. And there were various types of fibula. So apparently, what we have there is at the head, when they put the body on the shroud, they took and attached this small pillow that had a chain connected to it so that the forehead would rest against that. So that connects that shroud, not the shroud, but that fabric that is found in Spain that is known to have gone back to at least the year 500 and probably beyond that with the Shroud of Turin. This might very well be, remember the gospel when he goes in and he looks in the tomb and there are the wrappings, but then there is the headpiece that is separate and has been folded and put in a different region. So the Sidarium of Oviedo is in fact possibly that which is found in the tomb as well. But let's go on. We'll come back to that, but let's go on with another aspect that's a little bit alarming. And that is the fact that if you look at the hands that are crossed over, you will in fact find that this is not quite right. There's something a little bit uncomfortable about the appearance of these hands. What is it? Well, this hand looks normal here, and this wrist coming down. This arm, they're both elbows at the same level. There's something strange about that hand when you compare it with the right hand. The left hand seems to extend farther down. The wrist is hidden behind the hand of the left. But this seems, this should be the level, and this should be at the same level if it's crossed over. But the hand seems to be farther down. That's another intriguing aspect. Perhaps our restitution can, in fact, help us understand. Now, the index and the middle finger here, our fingers are extended, while the ring finger and the little finger are bent towards the palm, with the second and the third phalange clearly visible. The thumb is also bent in such a way that the nail bed is projecting to the surface of the abdomen. The third phalange can be seen protruding between the middle and ring finger. And if we look at this, and it's going back, now this is going to have some sound with it.
A muscular effort, therefore a voluntary movement, is extremely important. This extraordinary discovery that the images were produced by consecutive bursts of energy and that they show the different positions the hand adopted during movement of the hand indicates a muscular
So what
effort.
he's saying really is the fact that why the one hand extends seemingly farther, this is not an anatomical position, is that it in fact represents that scopic movement of the hand back or down. So the hand is really anatomically correct, but one time it was extended down and then pulled back. There was movement in that hand. So the image captures it seemingly out of anatomical proportion. But in reality, if you look at all the movement, if you look at the parallel lines of projection, what you will find is that this hand was here, then it was here, then it was here. So there is a movement of the hand one over the other, according to this analysis. Now, if we go back to that belt again, we find something else very interesting. As I mentioned earlier, the loincloth, or the caloson, we can also find there that it has movement again of the belt buckle. There is movement of that belt and the belt buckle that can be restituted from the image. And that might in fact reflect that the chest was impeded. And so if you impede the chest, where do you breathe from? You breathe from your abdomen only. You can do that if you hold your chest firm enough. Then the movement will come from the belly rather than the movement of the whole chest. So that might in fact be documented. I think we have to start and carry on. I know this is a lot of information. I'm doing my best to keep moving, but I have too much information. That's my problem. That's always been my problem. I kill my students because of this. You know, the medical students used to say, they say, what about this Dr. Weaver? Because I lectured for medical histology and pathology, and they would say, oh, Dr. Weaver, he has a heart condition. He doesn't have one. He is unmerciful. And I would say, oh, this kind face would never be like that. And besides, I have the stents to prove it. At any rate, let's get going here. Now, again, this was a demonstration. I don't know if I'll be able to see the movement, but let's move on. Now, there are someone asked me earlier about the patches and the holes and the lines. Yes, there are a lot of artifacts. And one of those artifacts are the so-called poker holes that occur in the shroud. They generally have an L-shaped appearance, and you will see them. Let me see there. I've outlined them there and also there. So they're a little bit distracting. They are thought to be caused by a burning artifact, either by coals or a type of what did I put here? Pitch soaked torch, maybe, when they were walking near the shroud during earlier times, may have spilled something on it as well, in addition to the fire burns, 1532. Now, if we look at one source of 12th century validation for the Shroud of Turin, there is a codex called the Prey Codex. The Prey comes from his name. And this is a Hungarian document. But in that document from the 12th century, it portrays pictures, representations of Jesus being prepared for burial. I think if we look at the next one, that will have the better details on it that we want to highlight here. Jesus is shown entirely naked. Now, that in itself is a little bit shocking. You know, you would expect he's got to be covered a little bit, you know, but au natural, Jesus wasn't telling people how he should appear, and he was in the human body. But that is a little bit unusual to have a naked body shown like that. But nonetheless, in this representation of his burial, he is naked as a jaybird, as they used to say, with the arms on the pelvis over the groin region. The thumbs on this image appear to be retracted with only 4 fingers. And you see that very same thing. Again, if we look at those hands, you don't see a thumb here or a thumb. If we did, it's covered up by the left hand. So that's an interesting correlation. Not only that, but if we look at the illustration, we will find that the shroud or the cloth that seems to be over the body of Jesus, in addition to another one that has been set aside, there is this expanse of cloth. And what do we find? Well, we find a kind of a herringbone pattern portrayed, rather crudely, but nonetheless, it does reflect some kind of repeating pattern that's similar to the herringbone. But we also find 4 tiny circles here, 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 and here. And if you compare those 4 tiny circles, you in fact find that they're very similar to the ones being portrayed on the shroud. Here, and here you see them again. 1, 2, 3, 4. The alleged shroud shows no image of a man. On the one that is folded up here, a waddled up cloth lies discarded on the tombstone in addition to the shroud. Now, practically the entire surface, okay, these are about the wounds that you find on the shroud. There are different types. If you go through and you analyze the types of scourge marks, you can distinguish at least 3 different types. The first is the most evident, associated with a Roman flagrum, similar to the ones mentioned by shroud researchers, always whenever they discuss it. It is characterized by 2 or 3 brown to reddish circlets, probably where the sheet was more soaked by the blood, connected by a lesser evident small bar. Second is more difficult to see it, but more numerous, a wider shape with parallel brown to reddish lines. And then the third type, which is very faint and is detectable only on the legs. So the wounds themselves seem to indicate not only that they differ in proximity, but they differ on the very type themselves. Now, a lot of people have looked at this, and a lot of information has been garnered from the information that comes with analyzing these points of blood flow due to wounds by various techniques. And they too, especially this young woman that's been working on them, what is her name? I thought I put it on here. She has done the most to indicate the different types. For example, type 1, you find in the yellow circle type 1 and type 2 in the yellow circles, and yet there are other types as well. So they used a variety of flagrum to induce the kind of surge marks. Now, I need to switch because we're going to come to the last portion of this, which I think continues the topic of, oh, okay. Now, this is what we want to see here. So you can see that the shroud, if nothing else, is in fact been analyzed from a number of vantage points and methodologies, some of which seem to be very revealing, others less so, some more scientific or experimental or empirical than others. Now, let's return to the original scene. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have put him." And then so Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple, the younger one, outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over, looked in, and at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. Peter was not shy. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. And this is the picture we often see. We see the main shroud draped on the floor, but then over here, neatly, sometimes too neatly, is another portion of garment that has covered the head of Jesus. I like this one the best because it shows that someone left in a great deal of haste. It shows that the shroud appeared also in terms of strips. The Shroud of Turin shows evidence that the sides have been cut off into strips of cloth, and these probably were used to help bring down the body of Christ from the patibulum of the cross of crucifixion. But I was saying I like this one the best because it shows that haste makes a lot of waste, but also this cloth here is not so tidy. It is separate, but it's not so tidy. So I like this representation the best. So if we look at scripture, we see that it is highlighted with a lot of references to the linen cloths. This is from Luke 24. And then, of course, as we just saw, looking in, stooping in, looking, he saw the linen cloths lying there, but he did not go. He saw the linen cloths and he saw the face cloth, which had been on Jesus's head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. So it's a little hard to escape the fact that the cloth was linen, based on scripture alone. Now let us move a little bit on to the story where Joseph of Arimathea comes in to prepare Jesus' body for burial. In Mark 15, then he bought fine linen, took him down and wrapped it in the linen, and he had him laid in a tomb. Matthew 27, when Joseph had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it into his new tomb. Luke 23, then he took it down, wrapped it in linen, and laid it in a tomb. And John 19:40, when they took Jesus' body and wrapped it in linen cloths, then they took him, and with aromatic spices, according to the burial custom of the Jews. So obviously, if the Shroud of Turin had a very direct, and as I say here, open legacy, there would be far less debate over its authenticity. But we have little information other than secondary sources. And some of these secondary sources are coming at you from various means. And so they're a little confusing too. The same story is never told the same twice. You can tell the story at one end of this room, and then interesting to compare it with the story that comes up at the end of the room. Well, that old thing holds true also within the context of the Shroud of Turin. But let's look at that period a little bit more closely. The Edict of Serdica, issued in 311 by the Roman Emperor Galerius, officially ended that period of persecution called the Diocletianic or Diocletian persecution of Christianity in the East, with the publication in 313 of the Edict of Milan. The persecution of the Christians by the Romans ceased, but it did not come to an end. There was that residue. You can say tomorrow, okay, if we were a very diversified group, which we are to some extent, but say half of them were Baptists and half of them Catholics, we say, all right, now you guys get along from this day forward, you're brothers and sisters. And you all walk out the door. And the Baptists go that way, and the Catholics go that way. Why? It takes time. So the persecution just didn't end overnight with the edict. The emperor could say, but like everybody else, the emperor puts his pants on one leg at a time. So it took a time for that to come into effect, to have a real force. And so as a result, you have a period in which that was theoretically true, but in practical terms did not. So as a result, during this time, Christians remained very secretive about what they said, what they did, and how they did it. And they even developed a system of kind of coded messages, which is known as the discipline of the secret. And this was a coded language that was used in order to protect themselves, their rites, rituals, as well as their belief, not only from people that were suspected to be Roman attached to the Roman government or officials, but to other Christians as well, particularly Christians in formation. Now you say, well, why would they be suspicious of that poor guy who's trying to become a Christian? Well, during this period, it's the most interesting period. During that period, which we call the era of patristics, the fathers of the church and the mothers of the church, is a very important period because it's a formative period of Christian belief. Not all belief was straight across the tabletop. So you had a kernel of people, Christians, who believe very strongly this way, but you also had dissenting groups, Arianism, for example, Manichaeanism. Those were all slightly versions of the main Christian belief. Some of them became heresies, so they were quickly discarded by the church. That's why you had those early councils, because they came together. The Council of Nicaea, for example, our faith is based on the creed. When was that formulated? One of these early creeds, because this is what we believe, not that and not that. So these people who were going through formation, they were excluded by means of this secret language because they were afraid that they would be influenced by other groups of Christians as well. And then they would get all confused. Well, do we really believe this or like they do? So to make sure that purity of the Christian belief remained intact, they formulated this discipline of the secret. And it was, again, an encoded language. I'll show you some examples of that in a minute. This is the most common one, the ichthus, the symbol of the fish. If I walked into this room and I saw a symbol of the fish on that door there, I don't know anything else about it. It's got the symbol of the fish. You might not pay any attention. I know there's a bunch of Christians hiding behind that door. Yeah, why? Because that symbol is used in early Christianity to indicate Christ, okay? For example, this represents the name of Christ, Jesus Christos Theo Eos Sotor. Sotor means Savior in Greek. And this means living, Christ is the living fish, or Christ is the living fish from 3rd century. So these were all ways. Now, there's an interesting passage of St. Jerome in his biography of famous people during that time, De Viris, illustribus, the biographies of the illustrious, you could translate it. He translates a passage from the so-called Gospel of the Hebrews. That was one of those early Gospels, probably a forerunner to the Old Testament, because the Old Testament had not been formulated into the Old Testament versus the New Testament yet. So the early fathers of the church used that, and they called it the Gospel of the Hebrews. Now in that, St. Jerome notes later on when he translates this, now the Lord, after he had given his grave clothes, the linen cloth, to the servant of the priest, and appeared to James, for James had sworn that he would not eat the bread from that hour in which he had drunk the Lord's cup until he should see them risen from the dead. And later on, according to that gospel, Jesus does go and visit him, James, and he says, come on, eat your meal. I'm alive. Okay. So what is this grave clothes, this linen cloth? That clearly says the Lord, after he had given the cloth to a servant of the priest, and the servant of the priest probably was, in fact, Peter. Now, this first resurrection in which he talks about James is not included in the four canonical Gospels. It's separate in this Gospel of the Hebrews. And this was an apocryphal writer written largely in quotations and used by the early church fathers in their formulations of faith. Now, if it is true that Peter was in possession of the shroud, most likely he didn't take it to Rome with him in 55. He left it either in Jerusalem where he was, but also another possibility was Antioch. The place heats up because eventually it became a more dangerous place to be. James was killed in 62 AD. Peter and Paul were martyred in 64 and 68. And of course, Jerusalem was sacked in 70 AD. So as a result, in this rise in danger, the Christians move from Jerusalem up into Syria, into Antioch. Antioch was already Christianized, but there's a number of sources that validate the fleeing of the Christians to Antioch. Now, we have another testimony from Athanasius, who lived in the 4th century, 328, 373, recalling this migration of the Christians, moving to an area of safety, in a reference to a sermon that he used in 68 AD. He says he refers to an image of our Lord and Savior at full length. So he said, for example, when all these Christians were moving up into Syria, they took something with them that had an image of our Lord Jesus Christ in full length. He doesn't say, well, they took the Shroud of Turin. There was no such thing. So that's what I mean. It's difficult. You have to be open-minded enough to consider all these sources that are pooling in various types of information, some more complete than others, some more fragmentary than others. And so we have to go back during this period and look at the various sources as well. So none of the less persecution would, some of the less persecution would also make its way to Antioch as well, particularly between 100 and 115. So it was not a perfectly safe place, but it was better than what was going on in Jerusalem. Now, if we look at this map, we see the red area here, which is the 1st century of Christianity and how far they spread. Now, I use this map. I wanted to use this map because it's a topographical map, and it shows you the mountain ranges. Now, look at these little Christians dotting all this whole area of the Mediterranean. You know, mountains were no barrier for those early Christians, which I find is amazing. So here we're talking about the movement of the Christians up into Syria, into this area here, from Jerusalem. This map shows you the expansion of Christianity again. Christians around the 4th century here, 325. Look at how they're spreading all the way throughout the Roman Empire. And then finally, this map I use because it shows how the Christians now have moved out of the area and even into the area and region of the Persian Empire here outside of the Roman Empire. And also because it highlights the position of a city called Edessa. Now here's Bethlehem and Jerusalem down here. And if you move up into Syria, here's Antioch, where many of the Christians fled, but they also fled up even farther north, and particularly to the city of Edessa. So, anything important there? No? All right, now, in the city of Edessa, in the 2nd century, it had already become a thriving Christian population under a ruler known as Abgar the Great or Abgar the Eighth. However, when the Edessian Christians wrote their history later in the 3rd century, they recall the gospel originally came to them in the 1st century from Jerusalem and through a Jerusalem disciple named Adai to the king Abgar the Fifth. Now, Abgar the Eighth was known as the Great. He was later. But earlier, Abgar the Fifth had an interesting relationship, supposedly, with Christ. Well, what happened? According to the legend, this king Abgar the Fifth had contracted leprosy and had heard of Jesus' miracles. So, acknowledging Jesus' divine mission, Abgar writes him a letter, "Dear Jesus," asking him to come and cure his leprosy. In doing so, he invited Jesus to seek refuge from persecution in Edessa because he is contemporary with the time of Christ. That part is known. About the letter is not so sure. Supposedly, Jesus blessed Agar, but declined his request. And he promised him that a future visit would happen by one of his disciples. One of the 70 disciples, Thaddeus of Edessa, is said to have come to Edessa bearing the words of Jesus, by virtue of which the king was miraculously healed of his leprosy. Now, the story of how King Abgar and Jesus had corresponded was first recorded in the 4th century. So the recording of this letter comes in the 4th century by Eusebius of Caesarea. Now, Eusebius is a very acknowledged by both Catholics and Protestants to have been a very prominent writer of the 4th century, a Christian writer of the 4th century. So definitely a very good source, not someone that's a little dodgy who lives down around the corner close to that end of that alley. No, that was not Eusebius, but a well-known Christian writer. So he recounts in his ecclesiastical history, he wrote this history that we still use today in terms of understanding the history of the church. He later retold in an elaborate form, recorded that this person, Ephraim, from Syria in the 5th century, in a doctrine of Adai, he recorded that there was, in fact, a messenger called Ananias, who was also a painter, all right? So he's connected with a letter, but that person was also a painter. And supposedly, Ananias was the one who painted a portrait, which was brought back to Edessa and presented to this king Abgar, who placed it in the royal palace, where it became known as the Mandalion. So in Eastern Orthodoxy, it's still known as the icon made without hand. So there seems to have been some kind of shroud with an image on it that traces its history back to the Christians in Jerusalem and perhaps Christ himself, that has somehow made its way to Edessa. Now, the first recorded evidence for the existence of the physical image of the ancient city of Edessa was made by this person, Evagrius Scholasticus, who wrote an ecclesiastical history as well, 6 volumes worth. And in that, he relates the existence of a portrait of Christ of divine origin, which effected the miraculous aid of the defense of Edessa when the Persians tried to invade the city in 544. So there are bits and pieces that come along that refer to this kind of miraculous cloth that apparently is found among the Christians. Let's take another source, the so-called inscription of Abercius. It's a Greek epithet that he was erected at the time of his death in Phrygia. And it's also thought to contain a reference to the Shroud of Turin. But this one is much more difficult to understand. When he writes about his trips, he went to Syria, all around Syria, even into Mesopotamia, and then he writes an account of it. And then he uses what may be discipline of the silence to record something he saw there. And he says, at one point, he was provided with, quote, a fish of exceeding great size, which possessed wine of great virtue that was mingled with bread. What does that mean? That's not an easy, but it's probably pregnant with meaning. If you lived at this time, you would understand. But we might be able to answer the question that it is, in fact, referring to the shroud, and not only the shroud, but the shroud with an image that has blood stains as well. Well, a lot of these have been analyzed very closely, linguistically as well, and the language seems to support many of the sources that are used as support. Now, by this time, the image of Edessa has become so renowned and popular that in 943, the Byzantine Emperor Romanus sends 80,000 troops to Edessa to retrieve the image and return it to Constantinople. He wants that image. And so he goes to Edessa and he's ready to sack the place. His troops are ready to sack the place, but the inhabitants of Edessa present him with this shroud, okay, that he can take back. And by this time, it's known as the Mandalion in Byzantium. And so this is 10th century, but it represents this shroud being handed over to save the city from sacking. Now, when it gets back to Constantinople, Romanus has 2 sons, and he lets his sons have a personal view of this shroud that has been brought back to his father. And one of the sons, he has 2, but there's one called Constantine. Romanus's son Constantine's personal description of the image is of particular interest. Why? Because it was extremely faint when he got back. We sent all those troops here for this. The image is so faint. Now, if you remember back to those earlier images of the cloth, that's not an image that jumps out at you. So already you have some reference. And furthermore, he says, faint and more like a moist secretion without pigment or the painter's art. Now that's very intriguing. Here his father's brought this piece of cloth back from Edessa, and he's making such to do of it. And I'm looking at it and I'm saying, well, I can hardly see anything. If anything, it looks like it has this moist residue on it. Now, if you think now, how does the image, if you walk out the door after this, what have you retrieved of that image? Well, it's not a startling image. And this might be early testimony of that event. So on August 15th, 944, great celebrations in Constantinople because the mandalion has arrived from Edessa, and it's stretched out against the board and sealed inside its oblong case, the face visible in a circular central opening that allows it to be seen by artists who will make copies of it. Now, we need to go back to that Spanish piece of cloth. Why? Well, there is some relationship here. Now, as I said before, the sudarium, or this face cloth, also known as a sweat cloth, is considered to be the cloth that was wrapped around the head of Jesus after he died, and is described in John 20, verses 6 through 7. Now, outside of the Bible, you need something outside of that source. The sudarium was first mentioned in 570. So outside of the Bible, there is a date by Antonius Pacienza, who writes that the sudarium was being cared for in the vicinity of Jerusalem, in a cave near the monastery of St. Mark. By this time, Jerusalem was overwhelmed by the so-called desert monks, and many of them preserved these earlier artifacts of Christianity. So by 570, we have a date for this other source of testimony based on fabric called the sudarium. Now, ironically, the cloth had been dated, turned over for radiocarbon dating, carbon 14. So when they dated the cloth, 700. But when they reported that date, the scientists came to a conference. They said, we analyzed a piece of this cloth and it's 700. But we know there's a real date for it. And there is a possibility that later oil contamination could have resulted in the late dating. So in this case, the scientists who use carbon-14 admit that the carbon date is one, but we know there's a real date, and we have discovered that there is contamination with oil. So you see there already, you have some disparity between the two sources that are trying to validate the veracity of the sudarium. Now, it is presumed that the sudarium has been removed from Palestine in 614 during the Byzantine invasion of the Byzantine provinces by the Persian forces. And so in order to avoid destruction, it was taken first to Alexandria in Egypt by Philip, then carried through northern Africa at the Persian conquest of Alexandria. Then it was in 616, it was removed to Spain, where it is to this day. So it has a long history. Now, a forensic study of the sudarium in 2015 found traces of limestone dust on the sudarium that were also found on the shroud in the same facial areas, particularly on the nose, and also proposed as coming from Calvary in Jerusalem. All this, along with comparisons of the blood stain on both cloths noted earlier, has led to a similar conclusion that both cloths were wrapped around the same person. And when they both went to Edessa, probably, but one was later ends up in Spain, and the other one, as we will see here, is going to have something of an extended mystery. The image of Edessa remained in Constantinople at the Church of St. Mary in Blachernae until 1204. So from 944 to 1204, we know it was in Constantinople, in the palace, okay? Now, in 1204, the Crusaders of all people come and they pillage and plunder Constantinople. And those guys were from the 4th century. They seized and plundered the city for several days. Now, there was one French knight from that group, and we know exactly who he was, Robert de Cléry, because he wrote an account of that invasion of Constantinople. He described the situation of the plundering, everything that happened, and he also noted that the local church, and this one that was found in Blanchernay, what does he say here? But among the rest, there was also another of the ministers, which was called the Church of Our Lady St. Mary of Blanchernay, within which was the shroud wherein our Lord was wrapped. And every Friday, that shroud did raise itself upright so that the form of our Lord could clearly be seen. And none knows, neither Greek nor Frank, what became of that shroud when the city was plundered. So apparently at that Church of St. Mary, they had taken the shroud and they had put it, it was later found this kind of, well, like this area here, almost like this, very same thing here. You take the shroud, extend it across, and then you can lower it and raise it. So every Friday in this church, they would assemble the shroud with this kind of piece that was connected with a pulley system, and they would raise the shroud so that all of the faithful could behold the image. And then it was stored away in a silver chest in the remaining time. So already at this point in which the Crusaders have plundered the city, there is also known that this shroud was not only in the city, but it was venerated in a very special way. But the problem is what? The problem is now it's gone and nobody knows where it is. You know, just when you think you have it located in a particular place, it sprouts feet and it moves on. Okay, so let's see what are the possibilities. It probably was stolen. Well, maybe he didn't think he was stealing it, but he took it along with his possessions. There was one fellow called Otto de la Roche, or Athon de la Roche, it's spelled both ways. And he was stationed in that same district of St. Mary and during the seizure of the city, and was later appointed Lord of the Greek capital in Athens. Okay, he most likely took the sacred linen with him to France in 1226, when he moved from Athens back to France. So while he was in Blanchernay, he may have taken the shroud, and when he was reappointed as a lord in Athens, took it to Greece, and then later in 1226, when he goes back home to France, he takes it back to France. All right. Now, in the mid-14th century, the knight Geoffrey de Charmey in Lirey, not very far from the castle of Otto de la Roche, married Jean de Virgy, a fifth generation descendant of Otto, and go back here, and so she's in possession of the shroud, and the first undisputed appearance of the shroud was at the church in Lirey in 1355, when it was exhibited by Geoffrey, who was the descendant of Otto, and his wife, or rather his wife, who descended from Otto, and she brought it along possibly as a dowry. And after Geoffrey's death in the Battle of Poitiers, the shroud continued to be exhibited by her in the local church until at least 1357. And if you look through the artifacts, you will find a badge that was given to the people who attended that exhibition. And there on the badge, what do you see? You see the impression of a double corpse, which is undoubtedly the Shroud of Turin. So, you know, more bits and pieces. So from there, we have it going to the House of Savoy, and the House of Savoy in turn gave it to, or took it to Turin. Now, these are all going to be dates here. I know you can't read it, I don't expect you to, but they're dates all in the 1400s. July 18th, what happened in July 18th, 1447? I can hardly read it myself. The court of Besson gives judgment on the case of Marguerite de Charnay de Liray canons. So there's all this data that's related to the showing of the shroud, the possession of the shroud. From all that point, 1498, King Louis initiates an extensive remand, blah, 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 all related to the shroud. So after that point, there's no problem with the documentation. That's why it's so easy to believe that date that is given by that group in the 80s for this period of 1260 to 1320. All right, now at this point, and coming to the end, I want to mention another approach to this relative dating of the shroud based on a cultural phenomena of looking at the evolution of the artistic depiction of Christ. And for this, I will return to a fellow I mentioned earlier, Paul Vignon. Remember his vaporograph theory of the transfer of the image to the shroud? Well, in 1902, after his first diligent study, he wrote a book called The Shroud of Christ. And that's when he presented that theory. Then he was pretty quiet for almost 30 years. And then he wrote the book of books on the Shroud of Turin, which incorporated science, archaeology, histoire, l'iconographie, la logique, and logic. So now, folks, you've got the whole story on the Shroud of Turin. Now, it was in this book that he developed a theory in which he attempted to demonstrate that the Byzantine artists of the 6th century through the 11th century had used the shroud as their model of depiction, or in some cases, out of necessity, had painted Christ's face from a copy which was painted from the shroud. So his theory is that the shroud was around already at this early point. Now, so in this second work, he sought to supplement the argument for authenticity by the archaeological data and essays that yielded a connection between the shroud and the most ancient paintings and mosaics representing Christ. In other words, up to that point, whenever you look at a picture or a painting of Christ in the catacombs, all the way up to the 5th century, what do you see? You see a young boyish figure, Hellenistic in every respect. But then after 500, Jesus suddenly becomes very Jewish. Why that sudden change? According to Vignon, they discovered already then the Shroud of Turin, which influenced subsequently all the visages of Christ's faith. Let's see if that's true. Now, in order to determine whether or not it has to have criteria, whether or not this is true. So he devised a system of 15 types of markings that became Vignon's markings. And here they are, all 15 of them. So if we look at these, for example, we would find certain criteria he used. For example, a transverse streak across the forehead. Here, a three-sided square, 1, 2, 3, between the eyebrows, a shape of a V shape of the nose, and so forth and so on. The raised right eyebrow, the accentuated cheek, so forth and so on. All right, so what I want to do very quickly now is, in fact, see if this does work. Now, if we look at this picture of Christ, the Pantocrator, from the 500s or the 6th century, we definitely see that there is reasonable similarity between the two. If you look at it very closely, if we look at this one, certainly we can see one raised eyebrow. Look at that nose, the cheek, and particularly this empty space between the mustache and the beard. That was another one of his criteria. Now, some of the markings do appear to correlate, but can we say this? In fact, what about if we looked at some contemporary images? We would find that three-cornered boxy area in some people's face at the top of the nose, that line across the top, before in the era of BC, long before the shroud. Okay, so let's just see if we can apply that. If we go and we look at these early images, yeah, I thought that would wake you up. Is it true? These are images going to be from 1st century. Yeah, pretty Hellenistic. But look at that one. That one was recently discovered. And where was it discovered? Edessa. In Edessa. So you see, that definitely is a departure from those boyish looks that we saw here and here, already in the 1st century. But that, he said, it didn't happen until the 5th century. Well, let's look at the 3rd century. Again, very Hellenistic, Roman-like. This is Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. If you haven't noticed, this is Lazarus over here. And Jesus, again, working in multiplication. Jesus as the good shepherd, all youngish, fair-faced boys, young men, you know. Now, what about the 4th century? So those seem to support his theory. They're all, you know. What about the 4th century? Well, he doesn't look too Jewish. But look at this one. Very definitely. Okay. What about this 4th century? Jesus is back to that fair-faced individual healing the woman with the bleeding. But look at this. He looks pretty Mediterranean, if not Jewish. Okay, and this is 4th century. Paul said it did not occur until after the 5th century. So as you see, as a result, some do and some don't. Jesus looks very boyish there. Looks like he's going through puberty there. But then from the same period of the 5th century, he's heavily bearded. So what I try to do is I try to go through here and see if his theory holds up in terms of portrayal of Christ. And what do you tend to get? Well, you tend to get a combination of both. But as it goes later in history, you do tend to have these more heavily bearded visages of Christ. That's a beautiful one there. There's another one. His beard isn't too heavy. This is 10th century already. That guy, boy, that guy give you nightmares. But it is a famous piece. But he certainly was influenced, if there was any influence. There he's got a fairly heavy beard, but he's also kind of, and certainly he almost looks like he's enjoying being crucified. I don't think that one holds any evidence. And what about this one? Is 11th century? He's pretty bearded, gentle but bearded. So as you go on through these early periods of art portrayal of Jesus, you see some combination of both. You see some of the more Hellenistic. So if you try to propose that theory, that all of a sudden you find this departure, why? They've discovered the Shroud of Turin. It's changed the whole tide of art history. I don't think you'll find an art historian who will believe that. Okay, but there are possibilities. And there's a little bit of intrigue there as well. Now, I wanted, this is the very end. I want you to look at this face. I want you to listen as you look at that face, what I'm going to read to you. This is from a homily that was given by our formation director, Father Lou, at the Epiphany, so several Sundays ago. And it's about Mary. And it's about Mary looking into the face of her son as a baby in the very beginning. And so we read that all Mary could do was keep this experience close, pondering, reflecting in her heart, and finally coming to the realization that she had been looking on the human face of God. And over the years, she would watch the face of a child grow from a boy to a teenager, and eventually a man, a face that likely reminded her of her own. And so she would see this face not only turn towards her, but also to the outcast, to the sinner, and to those in need. And one day, she would watch this face turn towards Jerusalem. And as she stood at the base, did it jump? Oh, now let me try it again. And this was supposed to be the climax. But anyway, don't let that bother you. And one day she would watch this face. Tell me if you, okay, watch this face turn towards Jerusalem. And as she stood at the base of the cross, she would look up at his suffering face and watch as he breathed his last. And in that moment, we see Mary cradling the body of her lifeless son, much as she did soon after his birth, looking intently at his face, pondering and reflecting all that had happened in our hearts. Among Christians, this desire to seek the face of God, to be in relation, has not diminished over the centuries after the resurrection. As Benedictines, we seek his face not only as a historical figure, but as a presence in our daily lives. For Benedict calls us to see Christ in the abbot, in the guest, in sick, and all who come into our lives, because Christ told us that he is with us always until the end of time. Like Mary, the Mother of God, may we have the patience and the courage to keep on looking for the face of God in every face that's turned toward us. Well, it didn't work quite like it was supposed to. It's supposed to have a very Hollywood effect. And I worked hard on that, trying to get the timing just right. But I wanted you to see and to experience how that evolution of that face could lead one to a very spiritual dimension of Christ in his birth and as well as in his life and resurrection. If that is reflected in the Shroud of Turin, we can consider ourselves to be a very lucky group of people. If it isn't, our faith is not going to change. We know he is still with us and will be with us always. And thank you for your kind attention. Oh, the message did come through from Romans. I love that passage. For I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers from Edessa, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. Amen. Any questions? Now, I apologize. I had too much information. It was too condensed. I learned my lesson. I'll be more gentle to my audiences.
Does the mathematical study of the projection depend on the three-dimensional nature of the image, the distance? Are those related or are those independent?
It's a way of taking two-dimensional and superimposing it on three-dimensional so that you can reconstruct that again on a two-dimensional plane.
But does it only work if the image varies with the distance from the cloth?
No, it works in all regards, but because it's parallel projection, when it comes into coherence, then you can see it very clearly. And then other images are fainter, almost like an X-ray. If you look at an X-ray, if they could all be as clear as that little square, then it would be beautiful. But you have that density change, that fogginess, and you know there's a change then in the configuration, the three-dimensional configuration.
And the image of him laying, you showed of him laying face down on the.
Now, this last group that uses this mathematical approach, it's geometrical restitution, claims that the body was face down.
For some period of time, or would it happen just when he was prepared and possibly?
And that they would not know, probably they wouldn't be able to.
Thank you. I
just wanted to mention the fact that we have a couple here, the Hansons, and the Hansons, wherever you went. There they are right there. They were in 1978, they went to Turin. They were in Germany. They were living in Germany at the time. And they went to view the Shroud of Turin. And they chose a day, which was the last day apparently. And they thought, oh my God, we'll be lucky if we can see it 3 miles away. There was no one there. And so they stood right in front of it. And Mr. Hanson snuck a photo of it. Mrs. Hanson was too spiritually inclined. So you got both types, huh? And they're still married. Yeah. So
I have a question about the loincloth that you were talking about.
yeah.
I'm having trouble reconciling thinking about crucifixion being done naked. And
yeah.
how would that have
Mhm.
gotten on him and all of that kind of stuff?
Well, that's a good question. We often see the crucifixion like right behind you is a very loose garment, but that's probably not the case, given that the Israeli type of clothing at that period. That would have been probably unacceptable, but it's often portrayed that way. So you're wondering again. Right. Well, that's a good, I mean, it's not only a good question, it's a good exploration of that period. I would say that this imaging here, since the rest of it seems so accurate, why wouldn't that be accurate? And so we might have to recalibrate some of our understanding of what that appearance might have been during crucifixion. You know, he might have had that very tight loincloth on, I don't know. But here's the other thing, since the belt that goes around it was tight enough to catch the blood that was coming down the back and causing it to move horizontally rather than continuing its vertical route, I would say that supports that. Even if you couldn't see the outline of it, something stopped the blood from flowing, almost like a dam. So a fabric-like dam, which would come with a belt, would seem reasonable. So again, some points of contention. I think you have to think it out, but who knows?
One more question here.
Here's our artiste.
Not a question, but as an artist, when I sometimes do a work with people involved, I do exaggeration. And I believe, look at any crucifix you see that we have in the Catholic Church or any other church for that matter. They all are a little different. And the reason they're a little different is because it's the interpretation of the artist. My feeling is if you have something as accurate as we've seen with the Shroud of Turin, with that aspect in the snake,
Belt.
belt, all of that involved, most artists didn't know that or ignored that part and made up their own kind of an image for whatever appeal they wanted to enhance with people. And so as an artist, that's what I say. You use exaggeration as an artist to make a statement in some way.
Yes. Now, and to further that point, this presentation on the Shroud did not come from personal interest. As I told you before, if I was, and I have, if I would choose an area, it would be the crucifixion, the process of crucifixion, period. No shroud. I'm not interested in shrouds. I'm interested in how Christ suffered, what was the point at which he died, and what led up exactly physiologically to that death. That's what I was interested in. So a year ago at this time, I decided that in our basement, I would put up a Lenten presentation, and it would be, wasn't the shroud, it was on the death and the causes of death and the crucifixion, for the crucifixion. So what did I do? I went throughout the house, stealing every cross and crucifix I could find for this presentation. But the one I wanted the most was one that is kept in the basement, the crypt of the church, of the new church. And it is the most gruesome corpus you could ever imagine. I don't think there's a piece of flesh that has not been left unturned and flipped over and the blood oozing out. Now it's of Spanish origin. And everybody knows that that's a Spanish tradition to emphasize the suffering of Christ. So that particular artist, whoever he was, another crucifix was taken from a cathedral that was bombed out in World War II. The monk was there as a chaplain. He got the corpus, and subsequently, when he brought it back to St. John's in the carpenter shop, they made a new cross for it. So you get that kind of thing too, where you've got styles being interchanged. And so to get the history of that, you need to know how you got it. But those two examples show you the difference in things that can happen.
One of the other things that is often depicted, where were the nails placed?
They
And
were
we have
not-
seen them both in the palm.
You need to
and
go down about 1.5 inches. Not this down here. No, doesn't need to go that far. It just needs to go right below the what we call the tensor retinaculum, above the wrist, around the wrist. And those bones and ligaments are enough to support the weight.
Are there any miracles associated with the shroud?
None that have been highly publicized, none that I have read of even. So that's most interesting, because unlike a place like Lourdes, where there's supposedly an apparition, it contains far less evidence. Has even recently they reported new miracles at Medjugorje, and those are all based on apparitional presentation of either the Blessed Virgin or Christ. But here we have something that's supposedly in the flesh, and we have a hard time understanding it. But as far as I know, whoever that person is, there's no miracles. So,
One more question over here, Father.
Okay, first of all, I'm very happy that God keeps us asking about him. That we don't always have.
that's right. We haven't solved everything, have we?
Yeah, because I think if we did, we'd probably stop talking.
We
We'd
probably
stop
would.
sharing. But I was wondering if there's any correlation between, and I don't have all the information. I've never been to Holy Land or anything like that, but there are the nails, there is the tomb, there is the wood of the cross. There are questions regarding consecrated hosts showing the flesh and blood of Jesus. And I'm wondering if all of those things have been pulled together, and DNA testing or anything that goes back to the shroud, just to compile all that information and make comparisons or anything like that.
Not really an overall, I think they're referring to kind of an overall systematic presentation of all this data. And what can we say coming forward? No, there hasn't. That's part of the problem. I have to get a little farther away from you. It's nothing personal. It's this microphone. But that's part of the problem. We got these things that are far and few located near one another. And the data, well, if you take something like DNA, that's interesting. There's a book called The DNA of God, and it focuses on this question. But the DNA is so not only contaminated, but degenerated, that it would be impossible, except maybe some very, like sex, maybe the sex of the AB group has been challenged. The other question that frequently comes is, why is the blood so red on the shroud? It's very red. It's kept its red color. But if you know from experience, you cut your finger in the kitchen or whatever, and you use your best dish towel and you throw it in the hamper and you say, I'll get around to it later. And by that time, what has happened? The blood is no longer that beautiful red. It's an ugly brown. And then you really regret not having acted on the scene at the time. But the point is, many people have questioned that as a source of suspicion, that no blood keeps the color that long. Then there was a theory and some testing that in that overwhelming physiological abuse of the body and the kind of physiological response in the form of shock, that and the loss of pressure, that the liver releases its bilirubin. Bilirubin goes into the circulatory system, and what it does is it hemolyzes the red blood, the RBCs. And then once hemolyzed, then the red color is maintained. So the change comes with intact RBCs, but if you hemolyze them, break them open, then the iron is released, and then the iron helps maintain that reddish color. But then there are some labs that say, no, that's not true. So that comes back to your question. That was a good case because here we have some people saying this, some people saying that. And so you often wonder, why can't we get this global kind of assessment? Why isn't that possible? We've got so many pieces and shreds of evidence, but it just can't come together yet. Now, maybe in the future, there will be some kind of definitive scientific method that will emerge that will allow for that total analysis. You know, I don't know. Until then, the data remains fragmented, sometimes in opposition.